You have a second house in Maine where you go each summer to compose, to reflect, to be alone, to play the piano. Could you speak at all to the necessity of solitude for both personal and artistic growth and fulfillment?
Well, I don't think anyone can be creative, purely creative, with people around you. I would find that very difficult. I don't know of anybody who can do that. So solitude is a way to find your deepest self. And if you want to express it in music or painting or poetry, whatever it is, I don't think that you can do it in any other way except to be alone. I persuade all of my pupils, this is interesting about solitude. Let's say they're about to be married, and so I persuade them to live alone for a year and then decide to get married.
I remember you mentioned that before to me.
Did I mention that to you?
Yeah.
I think solitude is a very important thing. To befriend, you have to befriend it. That is, if you have an aversion for being alone, then you ought to befriend solitude and give it a chance. With me, I always wanted to be in solitude. I'm a very social person, but if you give me my choice, I would prefer to be alone.
Ever since you were little?
I think so. Of course, I lived in a house with 3 sisters.
Yeah.
And it was quite a busy place all the time. Maybe that has something to do with it.
Yeah. I grew up listening to a cassette where you tell a story about a raccoon named Betty Crocker and her family whom you befriend one summer in Maine. And
the raccoon.
The raccoon, yeah. It's very charming.
I had never seen a raccoon.
Really? Yeah.
Until I moved to Maine.
Yeah. And you play a little bit of your own compositions in the recording. And I thought maybe you'd like to speak at all about some of the animal friendships you've sustained over the years in Maine.
Oh, well, it's very precious to me. I adore animals. I have to tell you a funny story about my English teacher, Clifford Curzon. I studied with him in London for 6 months. And we stopped for tea after a long lesson. And he introduced me to his gardener. And when his gardener left, he said to me, you know what my gardener said to me one day?
What's that?
Sir Clifford, the more I know people, the more I love animals. I said, I feel the same way. I'm not sure whether I like animals or people better. I think animals, but I'm not sure.
Yeah.
So when I'm living alone in Maine, I go out, I sit at the edge of a cliff, and what do I look out at? The Atlantic Ocean. You can imagine how inspiring that is, right?
Yeah.
And so there are chipmunks and red squirrels all over the area there. And so I put some sunflower seeds in a bowl, and this chipmunk jumped up on the table, scared to death of me, and then jumped down again, and then came back again, and then jumped down again, and then stayed, and took sunflower seeds and ran for his life. And eventually, he just became very friendly with me. I don't know whether it was a male or a female, but since I had a pupil by the name of Belinda, I called her female, Belinda the chipmunk. Well, Belinda allowed me eventually to pick her up, and she would stay on my shoulder, and she would rub against my ear. And one day I just bent over like this, and I kissed her on her haunches. And she looked at me very quizzically. What was that about? Well, after a while, I was in my studio, and Belinda came to the door scratching. She wanted more food. So I opened the door a little bit. She came into my studio onto my lap.
And then you practiced with her sitting on you?
No, I didn't practice with her. I was sitting in a chair. And she would sit on my lap and I would feed her. And then one day, with the door closed, I was practicing in my studio, and there was Belinda in the middle of my studio.
She'd gotten in.
Oh my heavens, she found a way to get into my house. I never found out how. And so I would feed her, and then I wondered, I thought she would go out and bring the seed into her hole. But she didn't at all. So I followed her when she left my studio, and she was dumping the seed in my bedroom. She was making a place for herself in my bedroom.
Oh.
Can you imagine? This is a wild creature.
You mean indoors? She got in and she was
She
leaving?
did, she stayed in. So, you know, I had to put an end to that.
Yeah.
I had to take the food away.
Ate it yourself.
I ate it myself, right? So this has gone on to this present day.
Oh.
I had a chipmunk that returned to me every summer for 9 months, for 9 years. I know it was the same chipmunk
By the
because she moved her hole closer to my studio door.
Oh. Could you see it from?
And when I whistled, I would go like this. And out she'd come out of the hole. She did that for 9 years. The people around there were in utter disbelief. You know, the locals.
Yeah.
They don't befriend animals the same way. They never heard of a chipmunk lasting that long.
Yeah.
So that's the story of my animal friends.
And you've written a series of musical pieces too, inspired by
I
animal
did.
friends.
I wrote Belinda the Chipmunk. You see, I used to take photographs professionally. So I have hundreds of photographs. And I chose the best raccoon photographs. You saw them,
For
right?
the cover of the raccoon book, yeah. And then perhaps more notable too, you have birds, the series of pieces.
Right,
of birds.
I didn't photograph the birds, though.
Yeah.
But on the cover is an original photograph of seagulls.
Seen from your book.
I wrote a book called Birds.
So
And-
with that in mind, whenever you compose, does it start with a particular idea or theme or image or concept?
Well, I decided that I was going to make a raccoon book. And I decided I was going to make a chipmunk book. And I decided I was going to make a Siamese cat book about my 2 cats.
Yeah.
About my other pieces, I can't count for them. They just appeared.
And is the process different depending on what you're composing? Like, will you work, like, do you work from the beginning to the end, or do you kind of go throughout, or is it just very organic?
It always starts with improvising on the piano. And while I'm improvising, if I find something that I like, I stop and write it down. And sometimes I just go right on improvising, and I have another motive that I enjoy, and I write that down. And sometimes then I go out and read, and then I come back, and I play what I wrote down, and sometimes I throw it out. But I learned not to throw it out. That's a terrible mistake.
Even if you don't use it to at least have it.
Well, you think you don't like it at the moment,
Yeah.
but then you see, oh, well, it's not so bad.
Yeah.
So I learned not to do that. So if I find a motive that I like, I sit quietly in solitude and I hear it in my head. And, you know, when you're a photographer, you have to get that special look in your client. It has a name. What name would you call it?
Je ne sais quoi.
Yeah, something like that. So when you're composing, there has to be an inevitable flow from what you already wrote down. You can understand that.
Yeah.
I mean, if I write down da da da, now what's going to come from that? Da 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 da, something. It has to be inevitable and flow out of that.
Makes sense.
So now, how do you find the inevitable? So a million tries. So now I'm going to tell you, here's the truth.
Okay.
I am never as miserable as when I'm composing. I am so unhappy.
Really?
And wondering, I wish I wouldn't be shouldn't be into this. I want to get rid of this. This is driving me crazy. I don't know what this piece ought to be doing. And I anguish and anguish and anguish. And so my conclusion is this. I think it's because of the anguish that I finally work it out. If I didn't have the anguish, I wouldn't work it out.
Yeah. There's several famous writers who've actually described sort of what you're talking about, where when they're writing, it's almost as if it's, well, one person went so far as to say kind of hellish, but it's like they feel themselves splitting inside when they write, because it's like you're observing your creation, but you're also creating what you're observing, so it's that split.
Yeah, I've read accounts like that, is what you just described.
Yeah.
I guess it's just part of the creative process. Although there are some creative people, it just happens. You know, it happened, for example, with Mozart and Schubert.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they confronted Schubert, and they asked him, when you write your symphonies, do you make a piano reduction at the keyboard and then orchestrate it? He said, oh, no. The entire symphony is finished from beginning to end with all the orchestration in my mind's ear, and I just have painstakingly to write it down. It's in a flash.
Yeah.
And some writers speak of the same thing.
Yeah, well, I think there's a vision of the final product, what's going to come, but even still in the process of writing over several years even, it certainly changes, but it's if the content works well with the change.
Well, but the point is, we're all different, right?
Yeah.
We create or do whatever it is that we're doing at different rates of speed. It's like nature.
Mm-hmm.
You know, on my road, I wrote about this in a book. There are blueberry bushes on my road in Maine. I live 7/10 of a mile on a dirt road. And sometimes I take a walk and I see certain patches of blueberries. They're ripe to eat. I take 6 steps forward and they're half done. They haven't ripened yet. So creative people are the same way. So here's an example. When Schubert was 30 years old, he had written 10 symphonies. Do you know how many Beethoven wrote at 30? 2. 1. So he was studying with Haydn. for an early part of his training. So what would have happened to the world if Haydn said to Beethoven, "You call yourself a composer? You're 30 years old." Schubert wrote 10 symphonies when he was 30. Maybe you ought to open a haberdashery store.
Sell ties,
that's
yeah.
possible.
Yeah.
Educators do that to students today.
I will say I've had a teacher for a literature class I took, and she said, she gave several examples of famous writers who didn't write their first books till they were later in life, and said, there really is no rush to get into it when you're 18, because it may not be the most natural course for when you're younger to write or to compose or something. But I think you're right, sometimes it's much more natural when you're younger. You've mentioned before with Mozart, when he was little, composing, and just happened.
Do you think you could train someone to be a Mozart?
Maybe to some degree.
To what degree?
I think, well, there's the adage about 10,000 hours of practice, and then you become a master at whatever
Yes,
is
you've read
your,
about that, yes.
your talent. But I think there are some things that we are born with that are most natural to who we are. And so, for example, like, I love history, but there's something about, like, the acquisition of the fullness of history that I just could never be a historian. I feel like even if I were to really work at it, it just doesn't seem to fit the makeup of my mind as well as creative work or writing or something. So I think in a certain discipline we are more suited than in others. Whether you could train a Mozart, probably not. I don't know. What do you think?
I think that Mozarts are born. It's purely genetic.
Yeah.
And that you could never train anyone, ever, to be a Mozart, ever. With all the training in the world, all the industry on the part of the person, namely practicing, right, never become a Mozart.
And I think it's the same even in something like athletics. Like, I can never be a Michael Jordan.
Well, there you are.
Tiny.
Certain things are genetic.
Mm.
As far as musical talent is concerned, the neurosurgeons have already proved something. They've had to do autopsies on prodigies and very gifted people, and they discovered that in the part of the brain right here called the planum temporale, talent is born right in here. There's a large section of the brain. They concluded that it's enlarged at birth. And if it's not enlarged, it never will get enlarged. That's very bad news about education, isn't it?
Yeah.
No matter how hard you try, you're not going to be a Mozart.
I'm okay with that.
Well, I'm okay with that too. I'm not a Mozart, but I'm a Beethoven. I'm not a Mozart, and so what we have to do, we have to be grateful for whatever talent we have, and we have to devote our lives to developing that talent to the best of our ability. Then we're very successful, happy people, without being a Mozart.
Yeah, and I've heard you say that before, that who we are most clearly is defined by our talents. And
It's my opinion.
Yeah, and that it doesn't necessarily just mean art either. I mean, it can be something like piano or cooking or being with animals.
Or sewing.
Yeah, or sewing.
Or being a gardener.
What would you say to someone who either doesn't know what their talent is, or has an idea of what their talent is, but isn't sure how it's applied to the world around them in terms of a career?
I can't help them. I don't know what to say to them.
Yeah.
I've tried. I'd never get anywhere. It's a lonely thing. We have to just do it by ourselves. You can plant an idea in people's mind.
But you can't. You don't know them.
You
as
can
well.
say, well, what do you mean you have no talent? Is there something that you like to do when you're alone? Well, I like to cook. I said, well, then that's a talent. You have a talent for cooking. Have you ever thought of developing that talent so that you explore the recipes of great chefs and actually create a great dish for your family? Well, that would interest me. You do that.
Yeah.
And then they never do it. And some of them do it. It's all it's personal.
Yeah. So your talent is obviously in the piano, but what other art forms?
It's not only in the piano.
Well, in teaching, I suppose, and composing.
It's not only in teaching and composing. I'm multi-talented.
What other art forms have you participated in over
I'm
the
a
years?
painter. I have paintings. I took it very seriously. I almost became an artist. When I was 12 years old, my homeroom teacher put across the entire side of the room manila paper this high.
Mhm.
So she pasted it on the wall. And she was going to lecture the students about Africa and the jungles and she said, so Seymour, here is a box of chalk. I want you to create a jungle scene on the entire side of the room. Can't imagine what came out of me. It's all gone. I don't know where it is.
Mhm.
But I was very talented in painting, in art.
Mhm.
I was also talented in writing poetry. I was always gifted in everything that I did. You are multi-talented.
I painted too. I don't paint as much now.
I know your nature. Your nature is one of multi-talents. Isn't it true?
I think so.
So I think it's only if you are multi-talented, it's only an accident what you choose to enlarge.
And how do you think painting has influenced, and other art forms too, have influenced you at the piano?
Oh, they interchange.
Yeah.
One influences the other.
Yeah.
They all have common denominators, you know. Form is one of the common denominators. You have a sense of form, namely tensions and relaxations. It comes out in sound or color or in word form, right?
The novelist Willa Cather, she loved Dutch landscape paintings. And there's a technique where there's something big in the foreground. It might be a big sloping hill.
Uh-huh.
And then in the background, it kind of opens up. And
Uh-huh.
then there's the horizon and, clouds and stuff. And so she took this technique and used it in her novels, where there might be it might be a theme or something that stood in the foreground, kind of like that hill.
Oh, there you are. You see,
Mhm.
they interchange. I think that was very astute of you, Andrew,
Oh,
because,
thank you.
well, personally, I've had a lot of interviews.
Mhm.
Nobody has ever brought up how the arts interchange with each other. And so I think that was wonderful that you had brought this up.
Oh, thank you. Have you ever, the painter Kandinsky? He actually wrote quite a bit. He wrote poetry.
Did he?
Mm-hmm. And he had some philosophical works too, or theories on color. I think he had a theory on color. Well, if you read his poems, they have a striking painterly quality. There's something mildly, it's not repetitive, but the patterns in a painting, being an abstract painter as he was, whether it's the repetition of the word blue or red or something, But reading his poems and knowing of his painting, they're very similar.
Well, Mendelssohn was a wonderful painter, you know.
Hmm.
They're beautiful paintings of his.
Mm.
I'm trying to think of other of great composers and if they delved into other forms of creativity.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know of any?
James Joyce, he sang and he wrote poems, but that's still the same because he is a writer. I don't know. I can't think of any off the top of my head. So two of your music teachers in your youth, Claire Husserl and the famed pianist Alexander Brailovsky, they both studied with Leschetizky.
Yes.
And I was wondering if you noticed any overlap in their approach to the piano and to whether how they played or how they taught you. If there was a Leschetizky method.
Andrew, I can't think of any two people who were more opposite.
Huh.
But actually, that's more credit to Leschetizky,
Mm-hmm.
because this is rather embarrassing what I'm about to tell you.
Okay.
There's a book about Leschetizky that is teaching. It's something about the method of Leschetizky, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, he never had a method.
Really?
And the man who compiled the book asked me, since my teachers were students of Leschetizky, he asked me to write a preface to the book,
Mm-hmm.
and I rue the day that I ever did. Because I don't approve of that book at all, because he never had a method.
And the book claims that he did.
Of course, the book claims. It spells out the method.
Mm-hmm.
So he taught everybody differently.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, these two teachers of mine were exactly the opposite.
In what way?
One was very intuitive, and the other was a controlled artist,
Mm-hmm.
not as intuitive. Brailovsky, for example, was a world-famous performer. He was the first pianist ever to play the entire cycle of Chopin for memory in public.
Wow.
It took 10 recitals to play all of Chopin's works. And he did it 10 times around the world, and once on Chopin's own piano in Paris.
Wow.
Clara Husserl was never a world-famous performer, but she did play gorgeously. I remember how she played.
Mm-hmm.
I used to imitate her, but she was quite different from Brailovsky.
Mm-hmm. Did Claire or Brailovsky or any of your other teachers prompt you to compose?
Never. I would bring Clara Husserl little compositions when I was 14 and 15, or poems, right? And she would be very encouraging with, oh, that's lovely. Let's get on with our Schubert sonata.
Yeah.
That was it. She would never encourage me to go on.
Mm-hmm.
And Brailovsky, I would sometimes play him a new composition that I wrote, and he wasn't interested at all.
Did they not compose them themselves?
No, not at all.
So, did any of your teachers? I mean, in your book you mentioned, I can't remember his name, and he helped you to. He kind of prompted you to compose a bit. But other than
He was an editor.
he was an editor.
He was the music editor of G. Sherman.
Mm-hmm.
If it wasn't for him, I don't think that I would have pursued composing.
Mm-hmm.
You see, when I was in Maine, there was a family by the name of Mellor living down the road, and little what was his name? The son. Can't remember his name. He began piano lessons. So he came over to Uncle Seymour and he played me his first little pieces. So I decided to write him 2 bird pieces, and I was going to teach them to him by rote. So I just improvised a seagull. And the raucous sound of the seagull with fists on the black notes.
Mm-hmm.
So he learned this piece, and he couldn't wait to go home and play it for his parents. They spent their last money buying him an upright piano. So he went over to the upright piano, brought his fists down, and shattered the black keys.
Oh no.
Took them a year to forgive me. So I sent these 2 pieces to G. Shermer. Ronald Herder was his name, the editor-in-chief.
Mm-hmm.
And he wrote back and he said, I really love these pieces, but they're so short. What am I going to do with 2 short pieces? Why don't you write me a suite of 8 birds? So I canceled everything that weekend, and I wrote 6 more birds. I wasn't even serious about it. Just did it over the weekend. I sent him the 6 birds. They became the bestseller.
Well done. So
Then he did. We have to have book 2. Now, will you write a concerto for a teenage student? And will you do that? And that's how I began to get published. It was just like that.
what would you tell a pupil who wants to compose or to be creative but doesn't know where to begin? Because it can be kind of an overwhelming thing to have this vast world of music.
You bring up such powerful subjects. I can't believe you. How to begin? Well, that's the most difficult thing in the world. Here, I want to write a book. This is a real experience, I'm telling you. I wanted to write a book on the physicality of piano playing. And I thought about it for year after year after year. Okay, so one day, I said, I have to make a beginning. I didn't know how to write the first word. If I put down the, I didn't know how to follow it. Can you imagine? I said to myself, now how am I going to begin this book? Well, I think I have to decide what is the most difficult thing to do on the piano. And I decided what it was. To play a 2-note phrase. 1 note full and blend into the 2nd note softer. The choreography of that is one of the most difficult things on the piano.
Mm-hmm.
So I started with that and I wrote the whole book.
There's an exercise, I did it in college, and it's a writing exercise where you, instead of saying, okay, I'm going to begin with this word, and you can kind of overwhelm yourself, you just kind of write what randomly comes to your head, and you don't go back and edit. And the purpose isn't to publish whatever it is you've written, but to kind of clear out whatever block it is that has you from starting the piece or something. And even, you know, when I write, I may not necessarily, like, the beginning of the scene may not be what I first write. Sometimes you just pick up in the middle and then go back or something.
Well, you're a formidable writer. I've read your writing. So you know how to handle this beginning and how to develop.
Sometimes it just comes.
I read somewhere about a painter And the painter, in order to achieve spontaneity, the painter suggested that you have a stack of 20 pages, right? And you look at a subject, and you don't look at the painting, at the sketch at all. You just look at the subject and just move however you feel about the subject. Turn it over 20 times, turned it over, and now on the 20th one, look, see what happens. And then you can compare it and say, well, it's like an organic growth. That subject took possession of me, and I finally conceived of something that reflected that subject. And that's how this artist claimed you can develop spontaneity.
We've done exercises like that in art classes before, where you look and then you draw.
Oh, you've done that
without looking at them. Yeah.
Oh, so you paint also?
Yeah. No, I painted more in high school. Yes. Where or how does classical music fit into the modern musical landscape that is especially technologically oriented, and how is it to be preserved, or where does classical music sit kind of going forward?
Well, classical music will be here forever. Modern music will go on in its wandering, and it can never find its place, and it keeps changing all the time. Tonality is destroyed, and then now nobody likes to hear it. Nobody likes to hear atonal music anymore. So now the pendulum is swinging back, and composers are writing melodies again. And then I suppose they'll give that up, and then it'll be replaced with something else. And Bach and Beethoven and Brahms and Chopin and Liszt, they're here forever. And there has never been another one like them. That's the question to ask. How is it possible that such a tradition should come to an end? Do you know?
Well, you've said before that you think the composers are dormant within the performers, that, someone like Kissin, or even just a magnificent pianist, that they possess those capabilities of composing? Maybe not.
I think potentially
But the
Kissin
potential, yeah.
It is another Liszt, for example. But he's not going to compose. I confronted him, after a concert. Did I tell you?
Go ahead.
Well, the Sony company produces his recordings. So they invited me to the box once in Carnegie Hall to hear an all Chopin program. And it was simply overwhelming. So we all went back to see him. And he was standing against a wall greeting people. So it was my turn, and I said, well, Mr. Kissin, I don't have to tell you what your playing means to us. It's just, to me, it's the whole world. You're so phenomenal. But you know what you have to do now? He said, what? I said, you must never give another concert unless you include some of your own composition. Guess what?
I said no.
He turned pale and he screamed out, I can't! Just like that. The Sony people were horrified. They couldn't imagine what I said to him. I said, what do you mean you can't? You have to, you're another Liszt. You have to leave something behind. Like, I can't! And I walked away from him. What do you make of that?
Well, I think he's so wrapped up in the world of performing, and not for a bad reason either, but when you get so many, I mean, I can't speak from experience, but having so many concerts that he has booked, he has a public reputation, I think, to uphold, and it would be a very daring move, I think, to shift away from that towards composing.
But do you know why I was so bold as to say that to him? Because I read an article once that when he gets sick, he goes to bed and composes. That's what gave me the idea to encourage that.
And there's a recording on YouTube where he plays one of his pieces.
Really, there is?
I've only found one. It's maybe 6 minutes long.
Well, Horowitz was another.
Mm-hmm.
Rachmaninoff tells us that Horowitz used to compose a great deal.
And where have they gone?
Pardon?
Where have they gone, the compositions?
And so, but then when he became a famous performer, he made so much money and he didn't spend any time composing after that.
Did any of his works become published?
Never.
Mm.
So I was asked to contribute an article about Horowitz to David Duval's book on Horowitz. And I bemoaned the fact that he died and didn't leave anything to the world except these phenomenal recordings, but never anything of his own. So I don't consider that being a success.
So, do you have any projects you're working on now? Whether it's a composition or a book?
As a matter of fact, I am. I have for years I wanted to write a book about facilitating difficult passages on the piano, sometimes by redividing them between the hands. I showed your mother some difficult trills between the hands to do it this way instead of this way. And so either to divide passages between the hands or special fingerings. And I have a title for it. What was I just forgot the title. Here it is. Swindles I Have Known. So I wrote the whole idea to my publisher, and she said to me, I can't identify with it. She said, do you know what the word swindle means? I said, of course. She said, well, you can't use that in serious music. I said, well, then I'll just go to another publisher. No, I'll do it. So she's going to do it.
Yeah.
Everybody loves that. Swindles I Have Known. I'm cheating. Instead of doing it with one hand, I'm doing it with two hands. So
I see. Yeah.
It's a swindle.
Is there anything else you'd like to add?
About what?
In general?
No, I should ask you that. What do you want to ask?
It's been covered for the most part. Well, I guess one question that's kind of in keeping with the documentary, in the documentary that Ethan Hawke made about you, there's a scene where you're picking out a piano in the Steinway basement.
Yes.
And you go from one piano to the next. Sometimes you play one line, no, it's horrible, and then you go to the next one.
I said horrors.
Yeah. And so, needless to say, a pianist's relationship to their instrument is nuanced and perhaps particular. So, with that in mind, how did you come to have the piano you have now?
You mean this piano
This piano here, yeah.
My patroness gave it to me. It was on a platform in her mansion, 34-room mansion on East 72nd Street.
do the whole block?
Oh, well, it was the largest mansion in New York. It had 5 stories. And the music room was patterned after the music room in the Palace of Versailles in Paris. It's easily sat 250 people. So this piano was on the platform under a portrait, a self-portrait of Veronese. So when she sold the mansion, she gave me this piano.
What do you love about it? What do you love about it?
Its warmth, its sensitivity. It's an extension of my soul. That's what it is. Now, don't ask me where my soul is.
It's in the piano.
Do you know where your soul is?
There's a quote by Jung, and I'm trying to remember. It says something about the soul. Its center is everywhere and circumference is nowhere, or something like that.
Something like that.
Yeah.
Well, I think that all of us have within us a spiritual reservoir. And that spiritual reservoir is actually a microcosm of the macrocosm. The macrocosm being space, right? Mm-hmm. Our universe. It has no end, and moreover, the scientists tell us it's still expanding. So I have a feeling that all life forms have within it the microcosm of the universe. It's in here somewhere, and it tells us everything we need to know. We have only to consult it. But most people won't do it. You know why?
Why?
Because they're brainwashed into thinking that there is a spiritual essence somewhere. They call it God. And God will answer all our needs. So they don't delve within themselves for the answer. But you see, I think that what people call God is within us.
Not in the clouds somewhere.
No, of course not. It's within us, all life forms. So I consult the soul right here. The spiritual reservoir, I call it a spiritual reservoir. I won't call it I don't want to call it anything, actually. I think it's nameless.
Comes through in music.
Music is nameless, it has no words. You know what else has no words? The relationship you have with an animal.
Yes.
They don't speak, you know. Unless you're dealing with a parrot.
Yeah.
I've had wonderful experiences with parrots. Is it on?
Yep. Thank you, Seymour, very much for sitting here with me and answering these various questions and just taking the time to go through all that you have regarding your history as a pianist and your relationship to animals and everything else. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, I just wanted to say that I was looking forward to this interview because I know you to be such a remarkable person. And all of your questions reflected your nature.
And yours as well.
So I know whatever we do artistically reflects, it is ourselves, you know. Our talent and ourselves are one and the same.
Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome.